All right, thanks for joining me on another episode of Why Not Go, the channel dedicated to rock and roll. My name is Maggie, and after the last video, the Joy Division video, which was a difficult video for me to do. I was very emotional. I decided I'd do something a little more lighthearted, and do a video on stalking John Lydon. if stalking can be lighthearted, I hope I can make it fun. And this video also contains a very, I think, historic location in Sex Pistols history, and I'll talk about that as well. Yes, when we were at Lydon's house in London, his former home on Gunter Grove, I did a video on that, and I can put a link in it here. We did a few London homes of the Rolling Stones as well. And when we were outside of Gunter Grove, Joe said to me on camera, it's in the video, he said, are you going to stalk him? Because I was mentioning in the video that one of the viewers of this channel lives in Fulham, and actually lives very close to where Lydon has a home now, in Fulham. And I don't know where the address is, but Joe was making fun of me because he knows about my past, when I did find out where Lydon lived in LA. And by the way, Joe has his own YouTube channel, and one of them is called Tomorrow's History TV. I'll put the name here. And he's done a few music videos. His channel isn't solely music, but he's done some really interesting music videos on, he did one on Gunter Grove, on Lydon's house, and he's done videos on Jimi Hendrix and the Rolling Stones. So check it out. He doesn't go on camera like I do, but it's a fun channel, Tomorrow's History TV. So Joe was making fun of me that day outside of Gunter Grove because he knows about my past. And I just want to make it perfectly clear, I didn't do anything too crazy. I wouldn't want to upset someone's private life, infringe upon their private life. I had a friend about 20 years ago that I worked with, who told me in the 80s she was so in love with Duran Duran that she sat outside the house of, I think it was John Taylor. She sat outside his house for like most of the day, waiting for him to come home or go out. So I didn't do anything like that. She got a good picture though. She showed me the picture, and I remember asking her, was he upset? And she says, oh no, he was really friendly. But I guess it's something you do as a music fan. I have a video about searching for David. I guess that's another stalking video, where I looked for David Bowie in Vevey, Switzerland, back in, I think that was 1976. And I think it's something that maybe, when you're a music fan, you just want to know about, your favorite musician or singer, whoever that is. And Steve Jones, in this book, Lonely Boy, he has a really hilarious story in the book about doing just that. He loved the Faces, he loved Rod Stewart, he loved Ron Wood. And at one point, this is before Lydon joined the Sex Pistols, he was with Paul Cook and a couple of other guys, and he found out where Ron Wood lived in Richmond Hill. And he actually, they parked outside. I guess they had a van, they parked outside, and at one point Ron Wood saw them and waved at them, and that was a thrill. But then, of course, being the I don't know, the kleptomaniac that he was, he went back later and broke into Ron Wood's house, and he stole a portable TV and a jacket that he thought was Ron Wood's, but it turned out to be Keith Richards' jacket. And Steve Jones writes that when Keith Richards found out about the fact that Steve Jones was the one that stole that jacket, he got upset. So yeah, he was a music fan of Ron Wood's, and he found out where he lived, and and he stole from him. So yeah, so back in the 80s, as most people probably know, Steve Jones and Lydon both moved to LA. Steve Jones moved to LA in 1984, and Lydon moved to LA, I think, a bit earlier than that. I know he left Gunter Grove around 1981, and I think he lived in New York for a short time, and then he came to LA. I think he came to LA about 82 or 83. But back then, as most people will remember who are old enough like me, that before the internet and things like Facebook, you never really knew where people lived. It was unless they said it in an interview, you didn't really know whether someone lived in New York or London, or big rock stars like, I know Rod Stewart, he lived in LA a long time, but he probably had multiple homes, kind of like Mick Jagger. But back then, I kept kind of hearing and maybe reading that Lydon was in LA and Steve Jones was in LA. But as I said, before the internet, you were never really sure. And I remember when I was in a band, I was in a band called Community FK, starting in '83. And I remember the singer, Patrick Mata, told me one day, "Hey, I just saw Steve Jones on a bus." And I said, "Really? Steve Jones on a bus?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, I can't remember exactly what he said, or if he went up to him. And then also, speaking of the same band, the bass player in that band, Kevin Kipnis, I remember him telling me that Lydon held an open audition for bass players for PIL. He was looking for a bass player, and Kevin Kipnis told me that Lydon had apparently wanted Flea, but Flea wanted to stay with the Chili Peppers. That's what he told me anyway. But he said definitely Lydon had an open audition. It was in Pasadena, where I think that's where Lydon and Nora first lived when they came to LA. And Lydon had an open audition for bass players. And I remember asking him, "Well, what was he like?" And I remember Kevin saying, "Oh, he was rude." So maybe Kevin just played a couple of notes on bass, and Lydon said, "Next." I don't know what happened, but yes. But back in those days, you didn't really know where people lived, but unless, as I said, unless they kind of spelled it out in an interview. So Steve Jones, he's been in LA for 40 years. He just said that recently in an interview. He moved to LA in '84, and Lydon's been there a little longer. And but they lived very different lives when they came to LA, as far as their standard of living. Steve Jones, he writes in detail in his book about how he didn't have any money when he came to LA. He had to sort of couch surf. He slept on the couch of Michael DeBar's and his wife at the time, Pamela DeBar's. And it wasn't until Andy Taylor of Duran Duran let him use his house in the Hollywood Hills, and Andy Taylor got him some studio work and writing credits, that Steve Jones was able to buy a car. I think he bought a truck, he says in his book. But he came to LA with really kind of in dire circumstances, and I don't know why. I know he had a drug problem at the time, but maybe they weren't getting any money from the Sex Pistols. Maybe they were still battling that out with Malcolm. I don't know, but Lydon lived a very different life. He went to LA with Nora, and I know that she came from a very wealthy family, so maybe that could have been part of it. I read online that she inherited most of her father's estate, which was over 100 million pounds. So that might have been part of it, or maybe he was getting more money from PIL. I don't know, but he wasn't living the same life as Steve Jones. He wasn't couch surfing. I think they had an apartment in Pasadena until they settled into their house that I had found out about. But yes, it wasn't. It was a different time without the internet. I remember bumping into once I bumped into Paul Simonon on Melrose at a lunch place, and I got his autograph, which I have since lost. And I remember bumping into Ian Astbury of The Cult a couple times, and once he sat next to me at a movie theater. And I've learned later that both of those musicians actually were living in L.A. I think Paul Simonon was involved with a singer named Pearl Harbor. I always liked that name. And Ian Astbury, and I think his guitar player Billy Duffy, I think they both moved to L.A. At least part-time, maybe full-time back in the 80s. So it was a totally different time as far as knowing what was going on with maybe some musicians that you followed. So how did I get to know where John Lydon lived? So it was around 1987, and I was living in Hollywood near Sunset and La Brea, and it was right around the time when I actually got Lydon's autograph after a show at the Universal Amphitheater in LA, and I have a video on that as well. It's called "I'll Always Be Rotten," which is what he said to me. He was so sweet. But I remember it was 1987 because I remember where I was living at the time. And my boyfriend at the time, we went to a pub called the Cat and Fiddle a lot. And the Cat and Fiddle was a great place, great. They had a great patio outside. It was in an old 20s building. I'll show a couple pictures here. It was in an old 20s building, and it was actually a fish and chips restaurant and a bar on the inside, and then outside they had a big patio also serving food and drinks. It was just great. It was a great place, and a lot of musicians went there. I remember once going there and walking by Morrissey in the patio. I remember seeing members of the Bangles, and apparently Steve Jones, I'll show a picture here when he was in his kind of Harley riding days. This picture of him with Paul Simonon, also riding probably a Harley. They used to go there a lot. I didn't see them there, but I read that they used to go there a lot. And with Mickey Rourke, the actor, and probably other friends of theirs when they would go around on their Harley. So it was a very popular place, especially in the 80s for musicians and all different kinds of people. They had good food. So anyway, I was there one night. They had a happy hour, probably late afternoon. And I started talking to a young woman who was very well known in LA called Tequila Mockingbird, and I'll show a picture of her here. Tequila was a very colorful person. She was one of the first people that I remember seeing, having green hair. She had green hair a lot of the time. I'll show a picture here where she's with Lemmy. I think this might be from the 80s, if not the 80s, the 90s. And then I have a later picture of her with Steve Jones when his book came out. So I think that's probably about 10 years old. But she was really friendly, and we're enjoying the Cat and Fiddle. It's not there anymore, which is a sad loss. But they used to serve hot food, free food, with their happy hour. And I remember we're there enjoying our free sausages or whatever and drinking. And we're talking to Tequila, who I think she's been a singer, a promoter. She's done all kinds of things. But she was very well known in LA anyway in the 80s. And we're chatting with her. I think she told me she was doing something with Mitch Mitchell, the drummer who used to be with Jimi Hendrix. And we're chatting, and all of a sudden we start talking about Lydon. And she was a huge fan of Lydon. And, she knew a lot about him. And I always remember her saying to me, "Oh, you don't know where he lives? A lot of people know where he lives." And I was just like, "No, I don't know where he lives." As I said, before the internet, you kind of knew, like, "Oh, I think he lives in LA," but I didn't know, I didn't know where. I didn't even know what area he lived in. or Steve Jones for that matter. And she goes, "Oh yeah, he lives at Venice Beach." And I said, "Really?" I just couldn't imagine. Sorry, I guess maybe you do like the beach. I don't know, but I just couldn't imagine him laying out and getting a tan. I just didn't think he would live at the beach of all places. I thought maybe, I don't know, Topanga Canyon or Hollywood Hills or something. And I just want to be clear too. I've never been starstruck with movie stars or TV stars. When I lived in LA, I always lived in the flats, which is kind of where the normal people lived. But even when you live in the sort of normal people areas, you still see stars out and about every once in a while. I remember when I first moved to Hollywood in 1980, I remember seeing Madonna and Sean Penn at the grocery store. And you know, you used to see TV people too. It's just one of those things. Not every day, but it's you know, it's just one of those things that you see. And you just see famous people out and about. It's not that unusual. So, and I've never been starstruck. I've never gone up to anyone, but I guess it was the first time in my life I was kind of starstruck, because I thought, oh my God, you know where Lydon lives? And she goes, yeah. And as I said, she said something like, I would think you would know where he lives. You're a big fan. I said, no, I don't know. So I was glad she told me. I didn't have to ask. I'm glad she told me, and she described the house. She didn't even tell me the address, but she described the house and where it was located. And I'll put a picture here. And they live very modest. If Nora was as wealthy as I've read online, they live very modestly, because like a lot of houses in Venice, their house was right on the street, a narrow street, and they weren't in the part of Venice where the crowds were for, you know, Muscle Beach and all that. They were in a little more quiet part of Venice. And I'll show a picture here, which is, you know, I'm not revealing anything. This has been in the Daily Mail and on the internet for a long time. And maybe Daily Mail photographers used to camp out there. I don't know. But yeah, so she told me where it was, and she said she described it as being an older home, I think built in the 20s, kind of a block style. It's actually kind of a Spanish style. You can't really notice that in this photo. The photo is the back of the house where the garage is, and there is, you know, obviously car access there. But the front part of the house is just a walkway street. And kind of like a lot of beach cities, the lots are really small. He has no yard. I think that's an apartment above the garage there. And then there's a small space between the garage and the rest of the house, which is a really nice 2-story house. Not that big though. And then there's a small patio in the front where you see that wall there. And so anyway, she told me where his house was, and I said, oh, okay, that's interesting to know. And then I think that the very next night I said to my boyfriend, I said, do you want to drive by? You know, I'm just so curious. And so we did, and I always remember the thrill of driving by his house, and I just you know, think, you know, I wonder how he has it decorated. I don't know, you know. You know, I knew he lived there with his wife. And the house, that street there that you see, there's houses on the other side, and those houses are right on the sand. So their house wasn't right on the sand, but it was literally maybe 50 feet away from the sand. And I remember reading that Nora was the one that wanted to be by the beach because she liked to swim in the ocean. And so yeah, it was a real thrill. I remember the first night we just drove by really slowly, and just like, you know, I don't know what we thought we'd catch him, you know, leaving or coming in, and we'd say hi. I don't know, but we would drive by and you know, just slowly kind of look, and it was so thrilling. And just to put it in like context of where it was, because LA is very spread out, Hollywood to Venice is at least an hour drive. So this was like, there's no direct freeway. And so we would be driving over an hour to get there. And then after we circled the block a few times, and then we went back home. And I just remember I was, I was just so thrilled that I knew where he lived. And then we used to, after that, we used to drive by almost every weekend. I would say like the first like 6 months we would drive by. I know it sounds silly. I guess we were kind of boring people. I don't know, but we would drive by almost every weekend, and then gradually it got less. But we'd usually go like on a Saturday night or a Sunday night, and then sometimes combine it with something else, like maybe we'd drive into Santa Monica and do something, or we'd drive over to the busy part of Venice. I remember one time we drove by, and we were driving by really slowly, and I thought it was him, but the hair was black, but it looked like him. And so I'm thinking at the time, and he looked at us kind of suspiciously. We were just driving really slowly, and he looked at us really suspiciously. And I think looking back that was one of his brothers. And so it was a thrill. It really was. And I just couldn't believe that I knew where he lived. And, we'd always like drive by thinking maybe we'd catch him, maybe we'd catch him. And then I remember there was a few times that we decided to kind of walk the neighborhood. And as I said, Venice is a very, the lots are very small. So it's not like Beverly Hills where you're looking at a house that is behind a big hedge and you can't see anything. When you're walking around Venice, and especially the canals, he doesn't live on the canals, but those areas, you're looking right in people's window. So anyway, I remember once we were walking around, and there was a house for sale about 3 doors down, and I remember thinking, oh my God, maybe I could buy a house and I could have Lydon as my neighbor. I know it sounds so psycho. But I think it was $500,000 at the time, which was like much more than I could afford. Although now it's probably worth like $5 million or $3 million or something. But anyway, and then another time, and this is kind of funny. I remember another time we decided to walk, and there's a few stores, only about 2 or 3. Maybe it's just like one block or so. There's a few shops right near him, and so we parked our car by the shops, and I think I got a water or an ice cream or something. And I remember it was a warm night, and so we start walking. Again, we're walking on that street right there by his garage, and then we would usually kind of come around, walk on the walk street, and then sometimes we just walk the neighborhood because it was so pretty. And then, but I remember one night as we were walking by, I remember my boyfriend said, shh, shh, I can hear him. And I remember looking around like, what are you talking about? Because we weren't even up against the house. We were, sort of coming up to it. But he says, no, I can hear him. I can hear John Lydon. And I said, you can? He said, yeah, be quiet. And then we just both stood perfectly still on that little road there. And yeah, I could hear his voice. He had, he's got a very distinctive, loud voice. He's not quiet. And then I remember thinking like, oh my God, he's home, because I don't know if he was home any of the other times we came by. And so this time we walked around the side, and we're just kind of creeping around. I didn't know what to do. And then the wall in the front, and I'll show a picture here of that wall. And this is a picture taken in 2021 or something, also from the Daily Mail. And he's getting some takeout there, and you can see the wall is quite high. I think he's probably standing on a stool here or some kind of chair and getting some takeout from somebody. But it's like a 6-foot wall in the front, and it's just a small patio there. So we walked over, and my boyfriend, I think he was about he was tall. He was over 6 feet. I think he was 6'2", and he says, I can hear him. And I said, well, I could, and I think we could kind of hear what he was saying, but I don't remember what. I remember it sounded like he was very animated talking about someone. But I couldn't hear like exactly. I remember hearing some curse words, and I remember hearing like he was talking about someone, and they must have had a couch right up against the front windows there, because we could see, my boyfriend could see him because he could peer over the the wall. He says, "Oh, I can see him. I can see him. I can see his dreadlocks." And that was when Lydon had kind of big dreadlocks. And I'll show a picture here when he had dreadlocks like that. And then he said, "Yeah." He said, my boyfriend said, "Oh, he's sitting on the couch and he's right up against the front window." And because it was a warm night, they must have had their windows open. So it sounded like it was a gathering, like maybe a small party, but he was sitting right there, but not looking out the window. His back was to the window. And then I remember saying like, "Oh, I want to see." And I remember him kind of hoisting me up for like, however long he could stand it. And I always remember seeing his dreadlocks kind of moving around, animated like, and I could see his, I'm sorry I spied on you. And I remember I could see his dreadlocks kind of moving around, and I could hear his voice. There were some other people there, but you could tell he was doing most of the talking. And I always remember looking into that room, and it had a big high ceiling. It was like a 2-story living room, and he had like a Japanese kimono that was up on a wall up above. And I remember thinking like, oh, he must have it like decorated really kind of elegantly. It's not like his old Gunter Grove place. But yeah, that was just a thrill. We stayed there for a while behind that wall. He was hoisting me up and then looking. I don't know how long we were there. Maybe 20 minutes or so. And then I remember he said to me, he says, "Maybe we can sneak in a side door and pretend like we're part of the party." So, yeah, that wouldn't have gone down well, I don't think. But that was a real thrill. I mean, just to know that he was just like right there, I didn't want to disturb him or anything, ring the doorbell or knock on the door or whatever. But that was amazing to hear his voice and just see the back of his head. We were having such a good time out there. We were probably having as good a time as they were inside at this get together. As I said, he was talking about somebody. God, who knows? Maybe he was talking about Malcolm. He was talking about somebody, but I couldn't make out who he was talking about. But he was saying effing this and effing that, and it was fun to be there. I felt like such a kid, even though at the time, this was 87 or 88, I would have been 30 years old, or almost 30. But I felt like such a kid. It was just like, it was so exciting. It was just so exciting. And then, and then we walked up the walk street and walked around again. We never caught sight of him other than the back of his head and hearing him chatting. But it was fun. It was fun knowing where he lived. And I remember, as I said, we used to go probably every weekend, just drive around the block, usually a few times, or sometimes walk around a few times. And sometimes there were lights on. You could tell maybe somebody was home, but a lot of the time it looked dark, like maybe he wasn't there. And then this went on for probably until about 1990. In 1990, I moved back to England, and why this is an historic place as far as for Sex Pistols fans is because when I read in Glenn Matlock's book, Triggers, the second Glenn Matlock book, he talks about the Sex Pistols getting back together, and this was in 1996. So Lydon was still in this house in 1996. So I think Lydon and Nora moved from there to Malibu. I don't know exactly what time, but I think they moved to Malibu around 1999 or 2000. But I believe he still owns the house because these Daily Mail photos aren't that old, and he might spend some time there, but his main residence is in Malibu. I remember reading that he moved to Malibu because Nora wanted a pool, and you can see with this house there's no pool, and no room for a pool. Rather, there's no yard, just a small patio. But he often talks about having a place in London, and I know that's in Fulham, and 2 homes in in LA. So I think he still owns this home, but I don't think he spends much time here anymore. He probably has family members living there. But it is an historic Sex Pistols location because, as I said in Glenn Matlock's book, and he talks about when they got back together, and it was very spontaneous. I didn't realize that till I read this book. He says, Glenn says that he was in LA and he was doing some recording work, and I believe it was the recording engineer or someone in the studio who suggested that he call Steve Jones. And I think it was one of the people in the studio that had his number, and Glenn hadn't talked to him since, maybe not since he left the band in early '77, but he hadn't talked to them in a long time. And so Glenn called Steve Jones up. By that time, I believe he was living in Beverly Hills, and he said he was really friendly. And then he went to go visit Steve at his house. And then at that point, they called up Lydon in Venice, and then Lydon invited them over. And so the three of them all came over. It was very spontaneous. I liked knowing that. It wasn't pre-planned. It was just kind of, Glenn made the initial overtures to Steve, and then Steve, that prompted him to call Lydon, which he hadn't talked to since the band broke up in 1978. And then Lydon invited Steve and Glenn over, and that was at this house. In fact, he talks about visiting the house in Venice when the three of them got together for the first time in what would that be, 18 years, maybe longer for Glenn. And he talks about having to go upstairs to use the bathroom when they got there, and he ran into Lydon in the upstairs hallway. So I can kind of envision that, because I know that the living room had this, it was a 2-story living room, so maybe there was no bathroom on the ground floor. But anyway, I think it's historic for that reason too, because not only did Lydon live there, but this is where the Sex Pistols reunited in 1996 and started chatting together. And then he also writes in the book that when they were there at Lydon's house, they called up Paul Cook, who was still in London, and maybe they put him on speakerphone, but they all started chatting, and that got the ice was broken, so to speak, and they all got back together and started their reunion tours, which I think started that year in 1996. So that makes it an historic house too, in my mind, because that's where the Sex Pistols got together. But yes, as I said, I moved to. I kept going to Lydon's house just for fun. It was always such a thrill to drive by or walk by. And I never saw him, just that one night when we heard him, and I saw the back of his head with his dreadlocks. And then towards the end of the 80s, like 1989, 1990, we probably went less often, maybe once every couple months, but we still would go, and I was thankful my boyfriend was a big Lydon fan, big PIL fan as well. So that was a thrill. And then I moved to London and back to London in 1990 because my boyfriend was a bass player and he wanted to join a couple bands. He ended up joining Flesh for Lulu and Zodiac Mind Warp in the 90s, and I lived there for 7 years. And when I came back, it's funny how you change as you go through life. And I'm not going to cry in this video, though. I want to make this lighthearted. It's funny how you change in life, though, because when I came back in 1997, I would have been close to 40. I was 39 at that point. And I didn't drive by Lydon's house anymore, even though I think he was still there. I didn't drive by anymore. I think I was, when you get a little bit older, you're kind of more practical. And I probably thought, I'm not going to see him, or it's, gas is expensive and it takes a long time or whatever. But I guess I was more practical or more boring. I don't know how you want to interpret it, but when I moved back, I didn't drive by Lydon's house anymore. That was something I did in the 80s, and I have no regrets. I don't think maybe I shouldn't have jumped up and looked over his 6-foot wall, but I couldn't help it. It's just, I heard his voice. I couldn't help it. But that was a lot of fun. That was a lot of fun. And yeah, it was a fun time in the 80s. I'll never forget. Oh God, maybe I will cry. I'll never forget driving by his house all those times. And usually we drive around the block. We drive around maybe 3 times. And I remember my boyfriend he would usually drive, and I could be in the passenger seat. I could be like closer to the house. And I remember after we went around the block maybe 3 or 4 times, he'd always say, "Well, you want to leave now? What should we do now?" And I remember I usually always said, "I want to go around one more time." I want to go around one more time because that's where Lydon lives. And I don't know, that makes it special. So I would usually tell him that, just, one more time. I gotta go by and look at where Lydon lives. And it was fun. And I didn't infringe on your privacy. So I didn't want to do that. But it was a lot of fun. So I hope you enjoyed this lighthearted video of stalking John Lydon. And I'm curious to know if you have any stories of your own of I don't know, camping out at someone's house or walking by and looking at where someone you admire lives now or where they used to live. I think it's all fun. Well, thanks for watching. Until the next time, I'll be seeing you.